Hello, everyone, and welcome to the My Healthy Home Summit. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Caroline Blazovsky. I'm a national healthy home expert and an environmental residential consultant with over 24 years of experience. This summit is designed to educate you about the process of creating a healthy home, to learn how our homes may affect our health and wellness, and the benefits associated with living and working in healthier spaces. We have compiled the most decorated speakers in this arena to help you on your journey. Today, we are joined by guest Dr. Stephanie Taylor, who will be discussing our homes and how they affect our bodies and our immunity. Welcome, Dr. Stephanie Taylor. We are thrilled to have you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
As a leading medical expert, can you start by giving a quick synopsis of your background and how you became interested in how our home environments affect disease and our bodies?
Sure. So, I have always been fascinated by biology and then specifically medicine. When I was in college and medical school, I never imagined that I'd be working now in an area that is so heavily focused on the effect of the environment on our health. But when I was in medical school and in my subsequent residency and fellowship, I was practicing pediatric oncology. And I became very concerned about infections that my patients got while they were in the hospital. And it began to be clear to me that the building had some role in this. However, as a physician, when I talked with my colleagues, they said, just wash your hands, give the right antibiotics. That's pretty much what you can do. It's mostly surface hygiene that matters, as well as antibiotic treatment. However, I wasn't convinced that was the case. So as I tried to talk with the hospital manager, the facility manager, they didn't understand my language. I didn't understand theirs. They began to disappear when they saw me coming. So eventually in my 40s, I returned to school and got my master's in architecture and designed hospitals for, years to really understand the hospital. But we're not talking about hospitals. I get that. We're talking about our homes. But subsequent to my architecture degree, I was involved in a study in a brand new hospital in the Chicago area where we were looking at patient room conditions. And I asked the question of how does a patient room affect patient outcomes and patient healing? And the really cool thing about doing research in a hospital is that the patient is sort of like the petri dish in the bed. They're kind of like a biomarker for that space. And so even though we're not talking about hospitals, what we learned in that setting has also been very illustrative about how all environments affect our bodies. So think about the patient as sort of like the litmus paper for the building, and then extrapolate that concept to schools, offices, and most importantly, our homes. So it was really in realizing that patient outcomes were affected by the hospital environment that led me down this road of looking at all environments in human health.
Mm. There's so much I want to pick your brain about because I think you have so much knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about homes in general. What are some of your major concerns when we're looking at a home environment? I think let's start with things that would have the most direct health impact and something that homeowners would be very familiar with and just kind of sort of push it to the side and not pay attention to it.
I mean, great question. And for even what you said about what aspects of a home might impact our health, even that concept is foreign to many people. But you go out to buy a home, you look at the aesthetic value of the building, how it appeals to you. Maybe it reminds you of your childhood home. Is there land? Do you have dogs? Do you have a front yard? Not very many people think, I wonder what the medical history is of the previous occupants. Are there any consistent illnesses or sense of discomfort that goes along with this home? So I don't think people even, well, you do, and those people at this summit think about the health consequences. For most people, that's an invisible factor that is not really considered. So I think in my experience, there There are some sort of more obvious aspects, such as is there mold growth? Can you see um, by visual inspection? Can you see problems? Is there wet gypsum board? Is there a basement that has either puddles or dehumidifiers blasting away, trying to rectify a problem? But I think many of the health consequences of our homes are not obvious to us. And I think that is a huge problem. So my focus now is creating visibility around the health consequences of the indoor environment, and specifically indoor air, because there are many contaminants you cannot feel. It goes way beyond comfort to actual health consequences that are not perceptible.
So, what are some of those things that you look for that are the invisible factors, the things that nobody knows are there but affect us greatly?
One of the indoor parameters that my work has revealed to be very, very important is avoiding conditions where you have very dry indoor air. So humidification can be a very positive thing, but the word humidification for many people connects to mold, or connects to perspiration or unpleasant things. So I call it indoor air hydration. So one of the things that I've learned again and again and again from my research is that keeping your indoor humidity, if possible, between 40 and 60% is very beneficial to your health. So for example, the flu season, at least in like New England or in temperate climates, the flu season is really the heating season. When it's cold outdoors, you bring that air into your home, you warm it up, and unless you humidify, the relative humidity plummets. And that's when we have more airborne particles, more airborne viral disease, bacterial disease. Um, so low relative humidity is incredibly harmful. Most people don't have, and I didn't have any idea of that either before
I'm
my
going to
work.
ask you a question. Is that we often hear about, we always say in the summer we feel great. Nobody has colds and flus, right? We run around and we have closed spaces, we have air conditioning, but nobody seems to get sick. Then all of a sudden we go into these fall months and everybody starts to have the flu, cold, COVID, whatever disease is kind of flying around at the time, communicable nast, I call it. So does that happen strictly because the humidity goes lower and then we become more susceptible? What causes a flu or a cold season?
Well, I mean, it's not only relative humidity, but if I were to choose one factor to control in my home, it would be relative humidity in my living space, and try to keep it between 40 and 60%, because there are a multitude of impacts of dry air that are terrible for us. So, for one thing, if you have dust or particles on a surface and your air is really dry, there's much more likelihood of resuspension of those respirable particles. So you have more exposure in your breathing zone. But that's only one aspect of dry air. Another aspect is that when we inhale air that is less than 40% relative humidity, it dries out our mucous membranes, these little hairs called cilia that generally um, are washing upwards to keep things from settling in your lungs. The cilia cannot operate or cannot work when your mucus becomes more viscous. And this is like one of the problems with people with cystic fibrosis. Their mucus viscosity is increased. And that's one of the big reasons people with CF are more vulnerable to pneumonia. So low relative humidity causes more respirable particles in your breathing zone. It diminishes your respiratory immunity. And this is really mind boggling. When you say you have COVID or you have the flu and you breathe out into your home, the little bioaerosols that you exhale shrink very rapidly to reach moisture equilibrium with the air. And it ends up, and this is like, for example, Lindsay Marr, who's just a phenomenal researcher at Virginia Tech. She actually got a MacArthur's Award for her work. When the air is really dry, those respirable particles shrink so quickly, and so to such an extent that the concentrations of salts, mucins, and proteins that's in our saliva actually preserves the infectivity of many viruses and bacteria. And we used to think those were just tiny particles that were not really consequential because we didn't have the techniques to understand that they were often dormant but still highly infectious. So those are like three reasons that the low relative humidity is harmful. More things to breathe in that are harmful. Our respiratory immunity is impaired, and many particles are more infectious. I mean, it's so, and that's an aspect that most people are not aware of.
And but now we don't want people, right? So now people will hear that and go, "Oh no, I got to bump up my humidity." And then they'll start using humidifiers to add moisture. So say why too much moisture isn't good.
Well, so oh my gosh, so it's so funny. We can talk about one thing and it gets to the heart of the issue. The problem that people we you don't want to just humidify with abandon or with no precautions because if your walls are not properly insulated, you're going to have a cold spot in your wall, and that warm humid air, for example, in the winter will hit a cold surface and will condense, and then you have a setup for mold growth, or that'll happen in your basement because you know your basement's usually cooler, especially in the summer, and when that warm air hits a cool surface, it reaches dew point and you have condensation. So most or many homes are not really adequately constructed with a proper building envelope, um, without making it so tight that you're completely sealed up. So buildings aren't, especially in cold climates, are not really constructed in such a way often that healthy indoor humidity can be maintained safely.
Mm. And so when people talk about, well, I hear often clients, well, I'll just open my windows, I'll get fresh air, the air's okay outside. I'm just going to bring it in. I mean, we want to be outside. People say spend more time outside. This is something I always hear. Well, I'm just going to open my windows. Can you kind of talk about why that isn't always the solution to opening a window and getting good air?
Well, were you in New York City last June? So
Yes.
one thing, even if the outdoor temperature and humidity is in a reasonable zone, outdoor air is no longer necessarily fresh. So we can't assume that opening the window is going to bring in quote unquote fresh air. So because if you're bringing in either particulate matter, or if you're living near a highway or an industrial site, you're bringing in NO2 or SO2, that's not good for you. And other outdoor contaminants such as ozone, ozone in the stratosphere is awesome. It protects us from excess UV radiation. But ozone down at ground level is really inflammatory for our lungs. So if you have a high ozone day, you bring that into your home, it's it's really bad for you. So yes, sometimes opening a window is great, or going outdoors is great, but only, and that's a big caveat, only if you don't have harmful conditions outdoors.
Yeah, and we can talk about the fires a little bit because I don't think we've really touched on that. And I think it's a growing problem that we're going to see more frequently. Um, that was a huge issue for a large 100 million Americans were affected by the fires in Canada, which is a big number. And that's little fine particulate floating through the air. What encompasses smoke from a fire, and why is it so bad for us, and why do we want to avoid it? And I saw so many people eating outside, and I saw them in New York City, like they knew the air quality was poor outside, but they wanted to eat out. And I'm like, this is crazy. Why are you doing that? So can you explain why smoke is so bad, and why we need to start protecting ourselves from these types of environmental factors?
Well, smoke is bad, I mean, for a number of reasons. One, there's the particulate matter itself, and depending on the size of it, will reach different depths of your lungs. But there are other chemicals that are associated with fires, with carbon, burning of carbon-based molecules. So you do have NO2 off gas. You have ozone levels. Often the ozone will, will be elevated after the particulate matter is has diminished. So you think, oh, this is a nice clear day. I'm going to go outside and have a picnic or do whatever, and it's subsequent to the particulate matter exposure that you have some of these other harmful contaminants, such as
That's
ozone.
Fascinating. So here you're thinking, and we always do that. Like that's just a common thought. We see, oh, the smoke's cleared. We look at maybe the AQS index or the air quality index and we say, oh, it looks good. Let's go outside. And you're saying, watch out. There's an aftermath to that.
Well, it's kind of understandable that as humans, we consider what we can sense. So what we see, what we can smell, what we hear, what we feel. But unfortunately, a lot of the contaminants in the air cannot be perceived by our five senses. And so, but they're still very impactful. It's just like you wouldn't want to build your home on a radioactive landfill, even though you can't see radioactivity. You can get a Geiger counter, and if it's clicking away, somebody should tell you it's not a good place to build a house. But we don't have that luxury when it comes to indoor air quality, for example, in our homes. And that's what I'm working on now, is making those contaminants or constituents in the air visible so that you can manage them appropriately.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about? I think people are familiar with ozone because it's kind of been something, but just kind of explain when you talk about NO2, what is that so they understand? And then a lot of these contaminants that maybe come from fire or come from combustion, just so they understand what they are.
Sure, let's talk about ozone for a second, because ozone exists even when we don't have fires. And most ozone in our indoors, the majority of it comes from the outdoor environment, although certain electronic equipment or like in a senior living community, people with electric wheelchairs who recharge the DC batteries are producing ozone. And ozone is so it's O3, so it's O2, which is oxygen, plus another um, oxygen molecule inserted in there. So O3 is very unstable. It just, threesomes are not happy. In general, threesomes are unstable, including ozone. It wants to get rid of one of those oxygens. So it gloms onto your cells in your throat, in your bronchial tubes, and it causes inflammation. And so if you have, say, um, other contaminants like viruses or particles in your breathing zone, and all of a sudden now you have inflammation going on, what happens? Your respiratory cells have gaps, they're a little bit pulled apart. Infectious material can reach deeper levels of your tissue. If you have asthma, you're going to be more symptomatic. So ozone is sort of like the facilitator of disease. Um, so that's one of the downstream consequences of, for example, forest fires. If you think about NO2, nitrogen dioxide or sulfur dioxide, um, NO2, again, is harmful because it's not very water soluble. So if you inhale NO2, say from a highway, because it doesn't dissolve in your upper airway mucus, it tends to reach lower levels of your lungs, and it can cause all sorts of disruption, from inflammation to increased vulnerability to infections to, genetic disruption, which ultimately could be cause a malignancy. I mean, I'm not saying if you go outside next to a highway, you're going to get cancer the next day, but cumulatively, these things are not good for you. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into the interaction between the molecules in your cells, but um, we our bodies do not do well with reactive chemicals deep in our lungs. I'll just say that.
Yeah. And then you also mentioned SO2, right?
So yeah, so sulfur dioxide is thankfully a little bit less common in our homes. You can have exposure from diesel exhaust. SO2 is more water soluble, so you're going to feel the impacts higher up in your, like in your nose, in your sinuses, in your upper throat, because it dissolves into the water layer of your saliva and mucus. But it's also very inflammatory.
And where do we see a lot of these compounds, whether we're seeing ozone, NO2, CO, right? So we've got carbon monoxide to contend with. We actually have CO2, SO2. Where do we see a lot of these things forming in our homes?
So NO2 can be emitted from any stove that uses a carbon-based fuel, so natural gas stoves or propane. Um, can have a significant off-gassing of NO2. And actually in New York, I believe that gas-operated stoves are no longer permitted in new buildings. Um, so your furnace or your stove can emit NO2. Again, there are not very many sources of SO2 indoors. It's usually from a highway or a factory that might be nearby. Ozone can be produced by electronic equipment. Unfortunately, there are some air cleaners that before people knew about how harmful ozone was, some air cleaners actually use ozone to reduce odors. I won't say whose college dorm room might have had such a cleaner years ago, especially before Parents' Weekend. But ozone air cleaners are not something you want to have in your home. Um, Carbon dioxide is a gas that is generally produced either by outdoor emissions or when human beings exhale. We exhale CO2. CO2 is a great marker of occupancy. But CO2 by itself, unless you have really high levels, like over 1500 ppb, CO2 per se is not so harmful. It's more useful as a marker of other emitted chemicals.
I have an interesting story about CO2. And I had it happen in a couple homes where we had monitors in and we kept seeing this high level of CO2, but there weren't a lot of occupants. And I was like, this is so strange. Why is this level so high? So eventually, upon investigating, we came to find out that they had septic issues. The
Oh,
septic, and this is so strange, the septic, and for people who don't know, you can have either septic or sewer. That's your waste line, how your waste is when you go into the bathroom and you send your waste down
yeah.
or in your kitchen sink, right? It goes out into your waste
Wait,
system.
your kitchen sink. Oh, okay.
I
Sorry.
mean, you know what I mean?
Sorry.
Your drains, right? Any of your drain is going down into your septic or going out to a septic system or a septic or sewer. And so we found that these CO2 levels were extremely high. And then I started to look at these particular houses had septic systems that were actually backing up, but they hadn't backed up enough where you would see backup in the drain, where your drain comes up and then
Yeah.
you start to see a clog. And then people usually dump stuff down there, not thinking that their septic system could be bad. They just try to clear the clog. Well, that can clog from the back end of your system out. So these CO2 levels were extremely elevated because the septic was backing up. And I didn't realize after studying and reading about it, it can be a byproduct of that
Wow.
happening. And once the septic systems were cleared and cleaned and redone in most cases, that CO2 level returned to normal.
Wow. That's fascinating. So when sewage decomposes, you don't only have methane produced, but you have CO2.
Too. And I didn't know this, as an indoor air quality, I'm like, as a specialist, I'm looking at it like, why is this? And then I read up, I had to go find studies about it. And they said there was a correlation between septic gas and CO2.
Wow.
It's kind of
I
crazy.
just I just learned something. I did not know that.
I didn't know it either.
It makes sense. I mean, the microorganisms that are in sewage, they also have to respire. They have to they have to get rid of their metabolic byproducts. So it makes sense. But I didn't realize that.
And that's why I love sensors. Let's talk a little bit about sensors. But sensors allow you, and that's how we actually picked up a continuous monitor was sensing the CO2 elevation. And that's how we were able to ascertain what the problem was, because it wasn't something that was just presenting itself in a very clear manner. It was a hidden thing that can happen in homes. So can we talk about sensors a little bit and how you utilize them and like them and what they can do for us?
Yeah, I love talking about sensors because I think that you know, the sensor technology is improving, it's more affordable. And so in my work, I actually use this sensor that monitors 11 different constituents that impact our health, both individually and in combination. And the goal in my work in building for health is to create visibility around the health impact of indoor air quality because it goes way beyond comfort. You cannot perceive the reactivity and the inflammatory effects of low levels of contaminants. Most people don't understand that very low relative humidity is harmful. Many of us know that we go on a long airline flight, the air might seem dry. We're using chapstick, our cuticles get dry. Then you get to wherever you're going on vacation and you come down with a cold or a sinus infection or the flu, and you think, darn it, I'm on vacation. But that dry air in an airplane is really hard on your body. So sensors give us the capability of seeing the levels of these different constituents, both in my work, individually and in combination, and how it impacts your health. And if you're monitoring indoors and outdoors, which is what we do, you can decide, okay, today is a good day to open my windows. Today's not a good day. Today, I need to make sure that my humidity levels are appropriate to the best of your ability. So you again, if you don't see it or you don't know about it, how can you manage it?
Mm, I
So I think
love that.
sensors give us that capability.
I love that piece of technology because we can't register that information for ourselves, and our safety is so determined on what we're exposed to that's invisible. So you have to have some type, I mean, to me, being in this industry for 24 years, you need to have some type of something sensing for you because you, like you said, you cannot see this. It's not something that you can see or feel.
Yeah, and sensors allow you to detect these. I don't want to call everything a contaminant because water vapor is not a contaminant, but if you have too little, it's bad for you. You might have a guitar that goes out of tune in the wintertime, and you're aware of that. So you're like, oh, I need to put up, some, I need to humidify my guitar case, or you can wait until you have a pretty significant health issue from living in a contaminated environment. But by then, it might be number one, too late to do anything about it. So why not know about it sooner when you can actually remediate a problem? And sensors allow us to do that.
Can you talk a little bit? Let's end our discussion. Let's talk about the effect of our home on our immunity and our immunity on our home. Because I think there's this, we talked about this correlation, right? About our microbiome. So can you talk about that a bit?
So, I mean, if when now since the pandemic, pretty much all of us are aware that indoor air quality or indoor air viruses, for example, can affect our health. But what we haven't adequately considered, and I blame this on the lack of clinicians looking at environmental hygiene, we don't think about the effect of the indoor environment on our immune system. Because many of us, without being organ transplant recipients or without being on prednisone for poison ivy, we're slightly immunocompromised because of our environment. And that happens in a multitude of ways. Um, so, for example, I already talked about the consequences of low relative humidity on your respiratory immunity. But what a lot of people don't realize, as a matter of fact, none of us realized until about 10 years ago, is that when your skin is exposed to either low relative humidity or excess UV light, your skin, and listen to this, your skin produces hydrocortisol, which is an immunosuppressant. We used to think all of the hydrocortisol that is produced by your body, we used to think it came from your adrenal cortex. Your adrenal cortex is that little organ that sits on top of your kidney and it produces a lot of different hormones. The hormones go up to your pituitary gland, and then there's this homeostatic balance in your body. So we thought your adrenal glands controlled hormone production, except for things like estrogen and testosterone. But we now know that your skin can be a manufacturing site of an immunosuppressant
Mm,
that affects you know, your pituitary and your hypothalamus. So that's so if you think about your indoor environment at home where you spend a lot of time and you sleep, if you're not managing indoor air quality properly, your body is producing an immunosuppressant that makes you more vulnerable to infections and maybe to skin cancers. Who knows? That research is still being done. But we don't adequately address the effect of your indoor home environment on your immunity, on your metabolism, um, on your exposure to particles, which is related to cardiovascular disease. We now know that things like Alzheimer's are very much affected by environmental exposures. I mean, the literature is every week there are more studies that talk about particulate exposure and Alzheimer's or other neurological issues, how particulate matter or air pollution relates to suicide rates. Paper just came out in Nature Sustainability showing that, and this is in China. So clearly in Beijing, for example, outdoor air pollution is higher than it is in our homes. But the study showed that 1 week after a weather inversion, where pollutants are kept closer to the ground, 1 week after an inversion, the suicide rate in Beijing was statistically significantly higher. And that was in Nature Sustainability. Nature is a great journal. Peer reviewed. The controls were fantastic in this study. But we don't want to wait until we feel suicidal to address our indoor environment. Let's learn about it when the levels are low. Let's protect ourselves, our children, our pets, everyone. And I think sensor technology now allows us that sort of visibility.
That opens up such a thought process. First off, it amazes me that our skin, I mean, it doesn't, right? Our skin's our largest bodily organ. We know that, right? So does that mean everything you put on your skin, let's talk about personal care products. How does it actually trigger a how does it trigger that your immune system would become less? Like, so what causes that process?
Yeah. I'm not knowledgeable about personal care products and how they affect your skin production of steroids, but I can tell you that let's go back to dry air or UVB exposure, ultraviolet light exposure. It ends up that dry air and ultraviolet light penetrates the epidermis and reaches the dermal layer. And the cells in your dermis are made up of, among other things, cholesterol. Cholesterol is a ubiquitous molecule in our bodies. It keeps our cells nice and flexible, and it's sort of one of the backbones of our cells, of cell membranes. But cholesterol is also one of the starting products for cortisol or hydrocortisol, which is the immunosuppressant that our body makes. So if your skin is stressed locally, locally meaning our largest organ, your body produces more hydrocortisol, which suppresses our immune system.
Fascinating. I find that so fascinating. Hmm.
Um, so we're learning more and more about the relationship between air and our health. And then, Carolyn, you mentioned the microbiome. Most people are aware of the microbiome of their gut. We're told not to be careless with antibiotic usage because it kills all the good bacteria as well as bacteria making us sick. I mean, antibiotics are great when you need them, but you don't want to go take a Z-Pack every time you get the sniffles because it eradicates the good bacteria as well. Well, it ends up that each of us, by cell number, and you may know this, not by volume, but by cell number, each of us is about 60% bacteria, which is kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And so that 60% of that's our microbiome are bacteria and viruses and fungal organisms that live on us and in us. And they help us live. We wouldn't survive without our microbiome. We shed those organisms into our homes. Organisms come in from outdoors, and collectively, those communities of organisms are called the microbiome. So the microbiome of your house, microbiome of the air, microbiome of your gut. And as human beings, we haven't really appreciated the fact that all microbes are not germs that we need to eradicate. We need to create conditions that support the ones that are good for us.
Right.
So when you think about the indoor environment, your surface materials, your building materials, water vapor, the presence of VOCs or plastics, some of these different exposures actually are harmful to the good microbiome. And so if you're not aware of this or being careful, you can create conditions that have more pathogens around you than the good ones. And that's a whole, I mean, it's an interesting discussion. It's an interesting phenomenon.
So, how do we make our environment safe? So we don't want to do too much, right? It's a balance. It's everything's a balance. So we don't want to do too much to eradicate things in our home because we don't want to make this sterile environment because that sounds like that's not good, right? We don't want to live, that'll make us more susceptible to disease states. But we also don't want to be too contaminated where it's becomes
Mhm.
carcinogens, we're dealing with neurotoxins, all of these types of bad guys that cause serious disease. So it sounds like just like humidity has to be in this middle range balanced, it sounds like our microbiomes as well have to be balanced. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there's some fascinating books about that, about how the different places in our homes have different organisms. But clearly, if you have a high touch surface, you want to wipe it down. I don't think you need to use harsh disinfectants, but you remove surface dirt or debris. Interestingly, one great way, unless you have a frank allergy, dogs have a very healthy microbiome. And so if you want to do something simple, well, maybe it's not simple in all respects, get a dog. Let your dog lick your face, roll around with your dog. There are multiple studies that show that children and people who live with dogs, again, unless you're allergic to them, have a more robust and healthy microbiome and have fewer infections. Children who grow up in Amish communities and spend a lot of time with barn animals have 91% fewer allergies and infections in their early childhood. So a lot of animals are really good for us.
I know you have we I caught a spin of conversation before that you have a lot of dogs. You love dogs, right?
I have 7 dogs.
Oh,
The only
nice.
problem I have is my husband doesn't like dogs. But you got to choose your battle.
How does that work?
There's another discussion.
uh, happy wife, happy life. But I want to do a little fast round because we like to ask all of our experts some questions, and it makes everything interesting, and everybody kind of has a different take, and it also provokes some conversation. So, what is your favorite room in your home?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So you might now think I'm totally crazy. So where most people have like a downstairs powder room or something, I have my dog Sistine Chapel, and it happens to be a space where I have a special elevated tiled bathing area. I have another elevated tiled space where I can cut their toenails or clean their ears. But I also have the walls and the ceiling are a painted mural of dog images, like trust a dog with your life, never with your lunch. And I have these really fun lights hanging down that are like these
Oh,
different multicolored crystals. So I have to say, that's my favorite space because it's playful, a lot of primary colors. It's suited to sort of human dog interaction in terms of height and materials and functionality. That's my favorite room.
it's funny that you bring that up because this year at the International Builder Show, one of the big um, displays was all about creating spaces for our animals. So, dog bathrooms, dog showers, dog areas. I mean, not just dog, but any kind of animal. Like it's become a very, very niche topic for homeowners to because the domestication of animals has become so prevalent in human homes. So, I find that interesting that you brought that up, and I just observed it at the show this year that there was just such a big interest in creating spaces for our
Wow,
animals.
I did not know that. My architecture thesis was designing for human canine cohabitation in a way that's mutually respectful to both species in terms of sight lines, heating, cooling, materials, enclosure sizes. I mean, I obviously love dogs, and uh,
But
that's interesting to know
I
what you
think that
think.
that's fascinating because I think so some of the problems that we see, right, is when we have homeowners who bring in multiple pets. Like we'll have someone living in a small townhouse and they'll have 6 cats. So let's talk about that. I think that just to touch on it briefly, that it's really important if you are going to bring animals into your home. I think there are parameters and also steps that you need to take to ensure that it's going to be healthy. Whether that's making sure your ductwork, your filters are changed, maybe you add additional purification. How do you feel about that? Because it sounds like you spent quite a bit of time designing a space for your animals to cohabitate.
It's so important. And one of the, the pandemic, when people were working from home, one of the reasons some people were reluctant to go back to an office is they couldn't bring their dog or their cat. But I think so. In my home, for example, I did promise my husband that once we got beyond 5 dogs, I would invest in central vac, which is, that's a big investment. So that that particulate matter goes outside. It doesn't just get recirculated through a filter. Um, Humidification is really valuable in keeping particles and dander out of your breathing zone. Plus, if you have moderate humidity, you can pet and kiss your dog and you don't get a shock, and they don't get a shock. But so getting rid of particulate matter is important. Humidification is important. Obviously, cleaning up any possible mess goes without saying. Um, Also, cats, cats are a little bit different because they have a litter box and their
Mm.
odors and things like that. Six
And there
cats in a town sounds crowded.
And there's a lot of diseases that they carry, especially if they're indoor, outdoor cats. So you have to really think. And then, of course, we talk about antigens a lot. And when you do have animals, they did studies where they had a home with a lot of antigen, and then they left that home for a 10-year period, came back and studied it, and those antigens and proteins were still there. So, and that can get very high and cause all kinds of inflammation in the body. So it's important that if you're going to have animals, that's why I think it was so interesting that you brought that up, is that you really do have to treat your home differently if you're going to incorporate pets into it.
Absolutely. Speaking of antigen, cat owners carry an antigen in their blood, toxoplasmosis gondii, that's been associated with anger management issues. I mean, there are studies about that. So you do have to be careful, and I think um, making sure that you have proper air treatment, whether it's recirculation, filtration, um, and surface cleaning, is really important, as well
Mm,
as take care of your animals so that they don't have skin diseases or GI issues that are going to contaminate your home.
yeah, definitely. Um, so the second question I want to ask is, what is one of, and I think you kind of answered this, but what is one of your favorite activities to do in your home?
In my home, I love to climb. You're gonna you're asking things that nobody's ever asked me. So I have like ladders going up to like interesting little spaces. I also love to climb trees. Um,
Oh,
and when I buy clothes, if I say to the store owner, if I can't climb a tree in it, I don't. It's too tight. I don't want it. That's so I love to climb inside and outside. I love to
that's
skydive. I like
wow.
three dimensionality of the world.
Amazing. Oh my goodness. That's amazing. Were you a climber like as a child? Did you just, I mean, did you climb mountains? Are you like,
I, I do rock climbing. I grew up on a citrus grove, and so maybe that's why, because the best oranges were often at the top of the tree. I love climbing trees.
that's
You're
incredible. Oh
asking
my
me
God.
questions that nobody has asked me.
Oh my God. I love that. I can't even believe it. Um, so when you're climbing in your home, is there something in your home from a healthy home standpoint that you know you need to address that you haven't addressed? So a lot of we asked our experts problems with your home that you know need to be looked at, but you just haven't gotten around to it.
Um, yes, but those issues are generally around surface clutter, to tell you the truth. I'm pretty cognizant of the air. So, for example, again, my husband, if he wants to refinish a piece of furniture, he has to do it outside. He can't even do it in the garage because my son's bedroom is over the garage. So I'm like, nope. If you want to give yourself myelodysplastic syndrome, it's not going to be, you're not going to give the rest of us illness. So go outside. So the problems in our house generally have to do with like clutter in the garage but the, I'm very aware of issues with off gassing and the air.
Let's talk just briefly about when someone does a project in a home, because we've got so many occupants that like to do furnishing stripping, furniture creation, building, painting. I mean, artistry. We see so many people doing these activities in their home. Just touch on that briefly about you really need to be paying attention to what you're doing and how you're doing it.
So much. You really, really do. If you can smell a chemical, it's having an impact not only on your olfactory system, but probably on your lungs as well. So really pay attention to good ventilation if you're doing those activities. I happen to like to do stained glass work. So, when you're grinding glass or sawing glass to create something, you have glass particles. So I have to make sure my space is humidified. When I solder, um, when I do the foiling process and soldering, there's tin and lead. So I wear a
Mhm.
mask. I have carbon-based filters. It, you know, you're not doing yourself any favor by exposing yourself to those chemicals.
And ideally, if you can do it outside and do it, or even have a shed location or somewhere where if you're going to do these types of projects, I always say try to, if you can, have a space where it's not connected to your home and your HVAC, because it's just typically
Exactly.
home HVAC systems aren't designed to eradicate these types of things. It's not a commercial building where you have a hood and you're doing something under proper ventilation. You're just blowing these particulate into your house.
Exactly. It's interesting if you there's a lot of there are a lot of granite sheds in Vermont. And back in the 1920s, 1930s, there were people coming from Italy who were very talented in the granite industry. So they came to Vermont because the mountains were similar and there's a lot of granite in Vermont. But the climate's so different that these granite sheds are enclosed in Vermont. And so consequently, the incidence of silicosis and respiratory disease and the flare-ups of tuberculosis was just explosive. So people were coming from a different country with a different climate, different indoor conditions, doing the same activity and getting really sick. So ventilate, ventilate, humidify.
And even doing remodeling, we worry. I do a lot of testing of silica dust, and it's a lot of this ends up in homes in the ductwork. You do a remodeling project, you spackle, you do any kind of sanding and painting, and you do maybe cement work. And we end up with it all in the ductwork, and we see a lot of cystic fibrosis. I've worked with clients whose children had cystic fibrosis and they got silica dust exposure. So this is
Right.
like a real thing. And as we look at ductwork a lot, and when I analyze it, we see a lot of this silica dust from the way we build. It just gets trapped in the home. So getting your ducts cleaned is super important, and
Oh,
making sure that those spaces are really ventilated and cleaned.
that's interesting. You have an amazing experience.
Well, you get to see, like you do, right? You see things. It's a lot of it is just being in the field and seeing what's happening with different occupants and how things have affected them. Um,
Mhm.
what's something in a home that people see our talk and say, I saw this doctor. She's basically saying I've not, I need to clean up my air quality. What's something people can start doing immediately that doesn't cost a lot of money, that they can make significant changes to their health and their immunity?
I think that if the easiest intervention and the one that has the most widespread healthy impact is managing indoor humidity. You don't want it too high, but you don't want it low. And most people think that low humidity or dry air is okay, and it's really not. So I would say go on somewhere online or go to your hardware store and buy a little hygrometer. It's HYG, hygrometer, not hydrometer. Keep to the best of your ability, which is sometimes hard if you're in a very cold climate and it's freezing cold outdoors, but try to keep your relative humidity between 40 and 60%. You will feel a lot better.
How can they add it back in? So if you're too low, because I know my house, right, it gets low. What do you recommend for adding it back in the healthiest way possible?
Great question again. So you have to be careful with that because you don't want to buy, for example, an inexpensive humidifier and just run it like crazy and not clean it, and you end up disseminating particles. You might be disseminating bioaerosols. So what I do in my home is I have a wood stove downstairs and I have radiant heating. I don't have ductwork because it's an old farmhouse. So I use an evaporative humidifier downstairs because even though there's a tiny bit of cooling with evaporation, I don't really have to worry about that because of the wood stove. So I use an evaporative humidifier downstairs. Doesn't use much energy at all because the evaporative process is what, the BTUs come from the air, from the molecular change from liquid to vapor. And I use a steam humidifier in the bedroom, again, because it's hygienic and you have to clean the scale out occasionally, but be careful about going and getting an inexpensive, like ultrasonic humidifier, the ones that we generally see in the drugstore. Be careful with those because you can end up putting a lot of particles into the air. No matter what you use, you have to maintain it. But I think that not cheapest, bottom line, I think the most impactful intervention is managing indoor humidity, keeping it
Fascinating.
in a healthy range. That's not the only thing, but it's certainly important.
And where can people find out more about you, um, sensor technologies, find out about where do you think people can find the best science on their immunity and improving their indoor air quality, all of those good things?
Well, my website, or my company website, has a lot of information about all of what you just said, including articles with bibliographies that have references. So if you're interested in school indoor air quality and how that affects academic performance, we have material on that. Or if you're a senior person and you want to understand how you might be uniquely vulnerable, so my website has avenues around both sensor technology, the microbiome, and indoor air quality management and energy efficient indoor air quality management. So I try to make my website useful. The National Academy of Science has, you can subscribe to that. It's free. And every month, they're really good publications. There was one that I love actually, it was about a year ago. It's Why Indoor Air Chemistry Matters. Really interesting.
Mm.
And you could download them you could buy it if you want. If you want a print edition, costs maybe $30 for one of these substantial monographs, but you can also download it for free.
Can you give your website so everybody can have that?
So my company name is Building for Health, number 4, and the website is www.b4hinc.com.
Wonderful. And can they get sensors? What types of technology can homeowners get? People in the building industry, do you supply sensors there as well?
We have a really good sensor manufacturer that makes our sensors to our specification. You can contact us. We can sell you the sensor. We can sign you up with a subscription for the data analysis. It gives you a health index for your home. And if your index is low, we actually prompt the most energy efficient remediation. So we do sell an outdoor sensor, or we use the closest publicly available data source, like an EPA sensor. So we will say, okay, your health score is low indoors. And then if people want to look into that, they go on our dashboard and there are all sorts of analytical capabilities that are easy to use. Then we'll say, today's a good day to manage your humidity. Today's a good day to open your windows. Today's a good day to use a filter system.
Amazing. Well, I am so grateful that you took the time to be with us. And I'm appreciative. And I know people spoke very highly of you and the work that you're doing. And I can see
Thank
that.
you.
So if our audience has any information, they can reach out to you directly. So thank you for attending our summit.
Well, thank you for all
Appreciate you.
your amazing work, and thank you for reaching out.